Hello, good morning. It's Sally again with our series on the women of the early church and broadcasting from St. Michael's. And today I'd like to talk about the friend of Paul's named Phoebe, who we know as a patron for the Christian itinerant apostles, a deacon, and a brave emissary. That's how I've titled my chapter, because Phoebe is likely the woman who took the letter to the Romans over to Rome. And so we meet her through Paul when he talks in Romans about her in his letter and says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church in Cenchreae. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and give her help as she may need, for she has been a great help to many people, including me. So as we know, in any letter, if a person gets more than a simple mention, this had to be a friend of Paul's and a good friend. And so in researching Phoebe, you find out a lot of different things. He will write back to the church in Corinth many years later and ask them this rhetorical question, do I need letters of recommendation from you? And he says, no, you yourself are my letter, written on my heart, recognized and read by everyone. You're Christ's letter, not written with ink, but with the Spirit of God. And the changed lives of all the Corinthian people, including Phoebe, along with their determination and faith, and then obviously along with her willingness to take this letter all the way to Rome, these were evidence enough for Paul that he had done something that was lasting there. So Phoebe was one of these people, and obviously someone that meant a great deal to Paul. When we meet her, she's part of this entourage of believers in the area of Corinth. And Cenchreae is still there today. It's a small village just east of the large city center of Corinth. Today, the real city is gone, the village itself, but lots of remains are there. And the ruins of Corinth show that people from many surrounding cities came down from the hills to the city center to trade and shop and worship. So Phoebe's known for supporting the apostles by this method of patronage that was so common that we talked about in the last two sessions. And she was a prominent Roman woman who obviously held the respect of many within the Cenchreae church community. And somehow she rose to the top. So in Romans 16, Paul mentions many women, and I talk about this a lot in my book. And Phoebe's one of these apostle women who displayed the evidence of a female conducting work for the sake of the gospel, but with no one by her side or mentioned along with her. Like Priscilla, whom we talked about last time, is usually mentioned with her husband, although she's always mentioned first, which is quite unusual. Usually it was the man mentioned first, and then the woman's name would follow, but Priscilla was the leader in that group. So Paul calls Phoebe our sister, our Adelphe in Greek, and this could refer to a female member of a missionary partnership alongside other Christian brothers, or to a woman acting alone. And when Paul mentions people, he's really careful to cite each person with a greeting that somehow commemorates or acknowledges her particular service and role. And he says, for instance, in 16:6, greet Mary, who's worked very hard for you. And we have no idea who this Mary is. There are so many Marys mentioned in the Gospels and in the book of Acts. We don't know who this is. We can only guess. He goes on to say, greet Tryphena and Tryphosa, those women who worked hard in the Lord. Greet my dear friend Persis, another woman who worked very hard in the Lord. So he qualifies these people and describes a little bit about what they did. So due to their feminine name endings, it's assumed they're all female. Other women are mentioned along with male counterparts, and we'll talk about this woman in the next section, but he says greet Andronicus and Junia. And Junia's name was changed for many, many years to Junius, and then it was changed back when it was realized she was a female. He says greet Rufus and his mother, and also my mother, Paul says. And greet Philologus and Julia, Nereus and his sister, and all the saints with them. So a lot of women are mentioned in Romans. And Paul's writing to the Roman church from his home in Corinth at that time, and it was about 62 AD. It was one of his latter visits to Corinth. And as stated above, he likely met Phoebe during the first visit there when he worked with Priscilla, and much earlier on. And she may have subsequently traveled to Rome bearing Paul's letter, and Paul intended to go there as part of a trip to Spain and beyond, and we don't know if he ever did that. We know that he went to Rome in prison, in shackles. But Phoebe may also have been heading there for purposes of her own. Remember, we talked about Lydia, who was a purple cloth dealer and had her own business, really. So Phoebe may have been that kind of woman. But according to a book I love to quote by Carolyn Osiak, A Woman's Place, Phoebe may have been part of Paul's future traveling team. And an official envoy bearing a letter was to be received in the same way as the sender himself would be received. She was the authoritative representative of this sending and of Paul. So she functioned this way in regard to Paul, just like Timothy and Titus served as they bore Paul's letters to Philippi and then back to Corinth, and they acted as personal overseers of the church. So Phoebe's referred to as a benefactor of many. So she may have used her money for the benefit of many Christians, not just Paul. Paul is in debt to her sort of sphere of influence, so he can expand his mission in Cenchreae, and he sees her as an equal and able to bear his epistolary work. She also offered to be a host for house meetings and other benefactors, and in his letters he uses several titles and descriptive adjectives to talk about Phoebe, such as sister, deacon, minister, and servant. These were the various meanings of the Greek word diakonos in the first century and beyond. So often we assume this more conservative male perspective from the letters of Paul, but as I've said before, historical research indicates that lots of Hellenistic treatises will describe household management as involving the wife as mistress of the household, and she's able to make her own decisions, travel plans, and choices, much like we do today. So it's kind of interesting to realize that they were much further ahead than we think. Greek Roman writers often give these pieces of advice, calling women by the Greek word gynexi. And they say, do not chasten your slaves or run the household by maintaining discipline like a stringed instrument. Don't tune it too loosely or too tightly. And give payment appropriately when it is due. And this was addressed to females as managers of the household. So women are presumed to be authorities and expected to administer that. Just like we saw in Lydia, she was able to convert her whole household according to her decree and request. And additionally, this idealized Roman matrona not only maintained her own virtue, but made cloth for her own household and clothed them. And this expectation that women would manage their own households crept into Christian literature. And even Paul will cite in his letter to Timothy, therefore I want younger women to marry, have children, and manage their own households, and give the adversary no reason to accuse us of some kind of domineering male perspective. And in his letter to Titus, Paul instructs older women to instruct younger women, to love their husbands, and to be good household managers, which we talked about the word oikogoros, which is the manager of the house. And later Christian writers will follow this same theme. So Phoebe is described as this deacon of the church. She is not described in the Greek as a deaconess. She is not specifically noted as female, so she was considered a full-on deacon. This was her role within the church, but the function was not really a rank at that time. So often you find diakonos translated as minister or servant or helper. He even uses it to describe himself and his other co-workers. So there she's off. She's sent off to bravely cross the Adriatic Sea to make what would have been a very rough journey over to Italy. She arrived probably at the port city of Rhegium on the southern toe, or the town of Brindisium, which would have been the eastern heel, and would have felt very much a foreigner to that Roman culture, even just coming from Corinth. It would be hot, dry, dusty. She'd have to ask for rides with caravans. She would have had to make her way through longshoremen and roughnecks. There's a lot of Greek influence, but it's primarily a Roman colony and a trade center. So it would have been confusing at best. She would make the journey to Rome. She would find a follower, a believer. She'd have to give signals and signs and draw things in the sand to find Christians like herself. Remember, this was way before overseas correspondence, obviously before any kind of the connections and communication we have. And so she had to do the best she could. But Paul will write to the church and say, to all who are in the church in Rome, loved by God and called as saints, grace to you and peace. I thank my God to all of you. The news of your faith is reported around the world, I want very much to see you, so I can impart some spiritual gifts to strengthen you, to be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. That's in Romans 1. And so Phoebe would have been met with a fairly large community in Rome that, as I talked about before, probably came out of the diaspora after Pentecost, where there were, quote, visitors from Rome who were in Jerusalem. So they took that message back, they carried the Spirit back, and they started churches. And so she would have been able to meet people who were part of these underground churches. She would have joined a hidden upstairs fellowship, partaken in the Eucharisto, the Feast of Love, and she would have met many people, just as Paul named Junia, my dear friend, Julia, our other friend. There was a Claudia, Tryphenia, and Tryphosa. So Phoebe was a valiant emissary because it took great courage to cross the sea. So we'll move on now to my chapter 7, which is about Chloe. And who was Chloe? And Chloe is sent with her people. She sends out her people to Paul. And so we'll talk about who were her people and who are my people. So Paul writes to the church in Corinth while he is in Ephesus. He writes back in 1 Corinthians, "Now I urge you, brothers, in the name of the Lord Jesus, that all of you agree and that there be no divisions among you. As it's been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels and disunity among you, my brothers and sisters." So these people made an effort to cross the Aegean to go over to Turkey and find Paul and report about what was going on in the church. So in a little effort to revisit the chronology, we find Paul in Ephesus, where he's staying for a time before he heads back to Achaia to visit his fellowships there. And in the meantime, he'll go all around in Turkey and back over to Antioch and then back to Achaia. The miles he traveled were quite amazing. So the 1 Corinthians letter is written about 54 BC, before the Romans letter is written, to the large and prosperous urban center of Corinth. And their diverse population included people from Africa, Asia, Europe, Greece. It was just a bustling metropolis, really. And when you go today to Corinth, you can appreciate how big it must have been. And it had temples surrounding it on the hillsides, and it was just quite a center of trade and pagan cults. But why would these people have taken a ship, which I just talked about how hard it was to take a ship and be blown about by all the winds of the Grecian Isles, but to go across the Aegean all the way to Ephesus to find Paul and talk about a church conflict? So this conflict must have been a great crisis. And we all have been part of church conflicts and splits, etc. But nowadays we kind of downplay those as just part and parcel of what happens. But this wasn't the case with Paul. So this crisis would have been likely to damage the reputation of the Christian church. So it was really vital. So women like Chloe obviously were a central part of the fellowship there in this large city of Corinth. So he didn't say the people of Titus or the people of Timothy or the people of Silas or the people of John Mark. He said a woman, showing again their complete authority over their people, and maybe she was the one who organized the church. So they'd begun to open their houses for gatherings, like I talked about. And as stated before, this was well known now across the whole empire as Christian patronage. And people were proud of doing it. And according to Carolyn Osiak, these women were either hosting a home church or head of a household in some way, but they demanded attention and respect and honor. And they would do that. So often the key missionaries known as founding apostles might come to these churches. That would have been Paul, Titus, Timothy, Silas. And when they were teaching or leading the Eucharist or the love feast, as it was called, they were center stage. They would receive homage. People would not kneel, but they would squat on the ground. But just as we saw with Lydia, the women are well recorded, and they were the mater familias of the household. Such women, they were prosperous in business. They were surrounded by servants and family. So Chloe's reach would have extended to relatives, slaves, former slaves who had been freed, and children. There may have been grown children with their own children, but this whole entourage of people goes to see Paul. Now, historically, looking at Chloe, she may have been unmarried. She may have been widowed or divorced, or the husband may have just been absent, like we talked about. And her husband may have been an unbeliever, so they would not have counted him as part of Chloe's people. These Roman women lived very independent lives. A lot of the times when the men were at the games or at war or involved in the government under the Caesars, they were completely consumed. So part of the woman's ministry as a Christian home church leader would have been to even support single women or young women who were part of another father's household. Wives of a lot of Roman men who had virtually abandoned them, or Jewish nationalists who were Jewish but afraid to show their interest in Christianity, they would show up hungry to learn about this new word of hope. And then they would have been immediately received. Even in Paul's letters, he says, "Give my greetings to our brothers and sisters at Laodicea, and especially to Nympha and the church that meets in her house." That was in Colossians. Nympha's another person who had housed a church in Colossae, which is deep in the middle of the Galatian region. And it appears that Nympha is single. Maybe she's a widow, but she could offer her home as a church and act as the virtual leader of that church. The church that meets in her house may have represented a larger community of churches in Colossae. But the proclamation, the reading out of the Colossians letter probably occurred in her house or under her authority because she wouldn't have been called the leader of the church. But one can imagine this impact of a letter read in a house by the mater familias of the house. And he writes in Corinthians as well as Colossians, but he encourages different people who show up like this, the wives of absent husbands or unbelievers. And we've often translated this as his instructions to wives at large, but really these were probably wives that showed up without a husband. So he says to them, if a woman has a husband who does not believe, and if he's willing to live with her, let her not divorce. Who knows whether you might save your husband? And that's in 1 Corinthians 7. And Peter will also write to a believing wife who might be alone in her faith. He writes just to encourage her, not to chastise her or give some ironclad rule, but he says, be submissive and kind to your husbands, even if they don't obey the word, because they may be won over by your conduct. So when we put this in the context of what was actually going on, not in our context today, but we put it in the context of these women showed up by themselves. They were trying to help them find a way to show Christian love to a husband who was probably never part of the fellowship with them. So household churches may, in fact, have provided a cover for a lot of Roman women to attend assemblies and convert themselves, where in a public setting this would have been impossible. So God used all this to create these wonderful ways for women to become believers that may not have been able to. So back to the case of Chloe. The fact that her people are included may have indicated a large household or even children or husbands who followed their mothers or wives. It might have been any number of connections. So Paul's immediate recognition of Chloe indicates she was a central person in the network. And her people were the people who attended at her home and followed and supported the centralized and larger Corinthian church. And they themselves would have gone out to act as teachers, missionaries, messengers like Phoebe, who carried letters, places, even letters that might have been lost that we don't have. And according to the rest of Paul's letter, this disunity referred to describes believers who were trying to be allegiant maybe to other apostles and not to Jesus himself. So we see this today too. People start following a certain leader who is charismatic. And Paul was infuriated by this, and he knew how wrong it was, saying that it would make an idol of people bringing the message. And he downplays himself all the time in this regard. But he says in his letter, I urge you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you be united in the same understanding and conviction. And then it would have been incumbent upon Chloe to make this happen in her own household. That's why he addresses her. And she would have been the one to bring this to pass. So we can ask ourselves, is it part of our journey to bring unity within the area, the spheres where we have control, within our families, households, even groups that meet in our homes? How can we talk about unity, about our faith? What are some answers to the question that we might ask, who are my people? Well, if we look at the path of a life, it's easy to see that one's people are our friends, They're our colleagues. They're people who we come in contact with in the things we do in the community. They're our neighbors. There are others within the radar of our life experience who might need our time and our love and friendship. Our people surround us and they take care of us. They stay with us when things are hard. And then we are vowing to stay with them in a Christian sense. Because Chloe's people stayed with her by going to Paul to try to remedy this situation. And as women, we often have large networks of people, and in keeping with Chloe, we can serve and live alongside our people so that they will take the time to make us accountable and report to us and others when things are not the way that they should be. So we see this is very biblical for us to do this. There are many other women named in the letters of Paul and in the pastoral epistles and in the letter to his church in Philippi. Paul names out two women, Euodia and Syntyche. He tells them to agree in the Lord and stop quarreling, and that's in Philippians 4. And not unlike the people who reported from Chloe, someone reported on these women, and they say they're bringing the church down with their fighting and discord. They might have been quarreling over doctrine, or again, they might have been following some specific person and trying to make that person an idol. And Paul, in some translations of the Bible, a person named Syzygus is mentioned that Paul calls a loyal partner, a true friend, a true partner. That's who he's talking to. And he says, and this person was probably a pastor or a deacon in the church at Philippi. And Paul pleads with them, help these two women who've contended for the gospel at my side, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are written in the book of life. Clement later writes a gospel that's actually an apocryphal book and very interesting to read. He writes to a woman named Apphia, beloved Apphia, I commend her and the church in her home. He writes that in the book of Philemon. Writing from prison in Rome to a certain man named Philemon, a prosperous businessman in Colossae, concerning a slave that has run away. And Paul pleads with Philemon to act in love to this slave and forgive him. And then he mentions Apphia. And her home would have been the place where Philemon could go and learn about such love. So Paul's always networking people and see how women are such great tools for him. He greets Nympha, as I said before, the church in her home. He asks that the letter be read there. Pay attention to the ministry you've received in the Lord, Paul instructs, so you can accomplish it. He again mentions Onesimus in his greeting. He calls him a beloved brother. He mentions Claudia as the only co-worker in his letter to Timothy. He adds, Erastus remained at Corinth, but Pudens, Linus, Claudia, and all the brothers and sisters here greet you. He's writing in 2 Timothy 4. Finally, I'd like to close talking about a woman about whom quite a bit has been written in other small books, and you might enjoy looking those up. But her name is Junia, and I talked about her just now, earlier. Her name was changed for many years to Junius by translators for obvious reasons. They changed several female people to the U.S. ending. But as people went back and looked at older Greek texts, as scholars did, they found that there was an A at the end of this name. And she is a person to whom Paul would have written as he did for Timothy. He wrote to Timothy, I clearly recall your sincere faith that lived in your grandmother and mother, and I'm convinced also in you. And he says, keep ablaze the gift of God. He has not given us a spirit of fear, but one of power, love, and judgment. And Paul's friend Junia commended his recognition and regard. And he writes about her in Romans 16 and says, I commend to you our sister Junia, along with a missionary partner, we think, whose name may have been Andronicus. And in my book, I talk a little about the fact that they may or may not have been married, but it was common for missionary partner teams to travel together. But this Junia, he says specifically, she's outstanding among the apostles. And several books written have referred to her as Junia, the lost apostle, because we see her picture engraved, and I include this in my book. And so she's depicted in other paintings and literature over the years. We think she may have really worked alongside Paul And to call her outstanding among the apostles, that means she ranked along with the people we've named, Paul's great co-workers, Timothy being the first, Silas, John Mark, and others, including Peter. So she has high regard. And interestingly, there is an inscription on a wall in Corinth from the year 43 AD. And it's near the place in Corinth where things are gathered together in a museum as part of the Corinthian history. But it reads, "A woman of highest esteem aided many of our citizens from her means, and she welcomed them into her home. In gratitude, our people agree to commend Junia and give testimony of her generosity to our native city and to her goodwill. Our citizens will do everything for the excellence and the glory that she so deserves." And so, interestingly, this may have been the same Junia. It seems likely because she aided citizens, she had means, she spoke the gospel, she welcomed people into her home. And in closing, just wrapping things up, it's really been the purpose of my work, and in the book I expand a lot more on all these people and give historical facts and interesting tidbits about them. And then I also write dialogues that they may have had with each other. I do some fictionalizing of what might have been their lives, what their thoughts were, what their needs, and how they felt being alone, because most of these women were alone in their ministry and work. We presume that. So it's the purpose of my book to show that really to Paul and to other gospel writers and to us, the gender of these women makes a great difference and can make a difference in how the women carried out their ministries and in all the things we are particularly gifted with in the household. And then the stories of our lives today are outgrowths of all of these same strengths with which God has so generously and graciously gifted us with as well. So I challenge all of you to think about where are your particular ministries, great or small, household oriented or else. It doesn't matter. It's all for the love of God that we do these things, and I hope that I've encouraged you with the bravery of these simple but godly women. Thank you.